The West influences us a great deal.
Western media.
Western civilization.
With the growing influence of Western culture.
The West, Western civilization, Western countries, Westernized societies. If you follow the news, are an avid reader of social themed books, or you simply went to high school in a European or North American country, there's a high chance that you have ever come across this concept. Of course, when talking about the West, we are not referring to geography, or not about geographical positioning at least. The West is a cultural concept that refers to the societies of Europe and of European origin. Obviously, this includes all or most European countries. America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are also widely accepted as part of the Western world because of its European manners, languages, and values. The West as a culture is defined by Christianity, the rule of law, democracy, Greco-Roman antiquity, the Enlightenment, and humanism. However, there are regions that, despite close historical and cultural ties to Europe, are most of the time left out of the group. This is the case of Latin America. Latin American countries have historically been looked down on by its North American and European counterparts, and as a result, it has been excluded of the clubs where Western countries socialize, such as NATO and the OECD. There are three main reasons: cultural, economical, and political ones. Most academics consider that Latin America is different from the rest. Its origins as a melting pot of Amerindian, African, and Western societies have made it diverge from its Western motherland nations, Spain and Portugal. Or at least that's the most commonly presented argument. But this is evidently an oversimplification. The region is really diverse, and comparing Mexico with Chile can give you two completely different pictures of what Latin America is. Native influences are strong in nations like Peru and most of Central America, while they are almost non-existent in Uruguay and Argentina, and the countries in between have each its own combination of factors that together made possible the formation of what today are the nations of South and Central America. On the other hand, many claim that Latin America can be part of the West because it is an underdeveloped region. When you compare the economies of the countries that are traditionally included in the definition of the West, you will notice that they are rich. Few countries on that list do not have a high standard of living, large GDP per capita, or a high human development index. This is not the case in Latin America. The region, while not as poor as the rest of the developing world, has some great problems regarding its economy and social mobility. This has served as an excuse to leave Latin America as its own thing. Of course, this economic definition for Western comes with a number of flaws. Some East Asian nations, as Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, are among the largest and most developed economies in the world, but could not be considered Western by any means. Not considering that countries like Uruguay have a higher standard of living than some nations in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Last but not least, politics. Two things set Latin America apart from the so-called West. One, their weak democracies, and two, their international relations. It is not a secret to anybody that the developed world, where most of the West belongs, has solid constitutional democracies based on the rule of law. Latin America, in turn, is made up of several weak democracies mixed up with some dictatorial regimes as those of Venezuela and Cuba. Democracy is believed to be inseparable from the concept of the West, thus undemocratic nations and weak democracies are generally considered non-Western. This doesn't acknowledge the difference between politics and political culture. Most nations in Latin America were created with the idea of democracy in the mind of its founding fathers, or its process of development took the nations into the idea of a republican democracy later in time, in contrast with Japanese democracy, for instance, which was imposed by Western nations. Democracy is the preferred form of government even in countries with dictatorial regimes. This can be proven by the mass protest and pro-democracy demonstrations that were seen across Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua just in the last 2 years, and in the way all the countries in the region backed up those demonstrations and the freedom of those countries. This regional support was not something new. Latin America has historically been an isolated region, and most of its foreign affairs concern about Latin America itself. World events have traditionally been of little importance in the political agenda of the region. While close ties exist between each other, the West has usually just engaged in economic relationship with its former colonies in the New World. What's worse, Latin America has been afraid of opening up to the West because of its turbulent past as colonies and as banana republics of the great powers of Europe and the US after their independence. In other words, Latin America is not a close friend of the Western world. Yet the political behavior of the region generally shows alignment with that of the United States, Europe, and its allies. So, is it part of the Western world? If you ask me, yes, Latin America is part of the West. Of course, it is hard to argue about this topic with people that believe that European nations, as Russia, are not European enough to be considered Western. In the end, culture can be defined by economics or politics, but by people. Spanish and Portuguese-speaking nations, with a vast majority Christian population with a Western political tradition and European-rooted customs, that sounds pretty Western to me. By the way, the music in the background is a Baroque period sonata composed by the Brazilian organist Americo Lobo de Mesquita in the 1780s.